The sun had just set over the bustling city of Lagos, casting a warm orange glow over the Faith Rebirth Ministry, a church situated at the heart of Lagos. The church was empty, except for Pastor Emmanuel and his wife, Sister Margaret. They stood in the dimly lit altar room, surrounded by the eerie silence of the church. Pastor Emmanuel whispered, his voice dripping with reverence yet incoherent. Sister Margaret nodded, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural intensity as she mumbled, "Obedience is key," her voice slightly louder than that of her husband. Together, they made their way to the hidden chamber beneath the church. The air was thick with the stench of decay and death. In the center of the room, a young woman lay bound and gagged on an ancient stone altar. She was unconscious. Pastor Emmanuel raised his hands to the heavens, his voice booming with false piety. "Oh, devourer, we offer you this sacrifice. Continue to grant us wealth, power, and protection, and in no time, you shall be free again." As he spoke, Sister Margaret handed him a gleaming ceremonial knife. Pastor Emmanuel's eyes flashed with excitement as he plunged the knife into the young woman's heart. The chamber erupted into chaos as the young woman's body began to convulse. Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret watched with rapt attention, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. And then, everything went black. The Faith Rebirth Ministry was buzzing with excitement as the congregation gathered for the annual Harvest Thanksgiving service. Eve, a talented young singer, stood confidently on the podium, adjusting her microphone as she prepared to lead the choir in a rousing rendition. As the music began, Eve's powerful voice soared through the packed sanctuary, inspiring the congregation to sing along with gusto. Pastor Emmanuel and his wife, Sister Margaret, beamed with pride from their seats on the platform, clearly delighted with Eve's performance. After the service, the church hall was filled with the delicious smells of traditional Nigerian cuisine, as the congregation gathered for a festive meal. Eve, who was also the leader of the church's youth evangelism team, mingled with the other young people, laughing and chatting as they enjoyed their food. Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret made a point of seeking Eve out, praising her for her excellent leadership of the choir and her dedication to the youth evangelism team. "Eve, you are a true blessing to our church," Pastor Emmanuel said, his eyes shining with warmth. "We are so grateful to have you as part of our flock." Eve glowed with pleasure at the pastor's words, feeling grateful for the love and support she had received from the Faith Rebirth Ministry. She was grateful for her church, the best thing that had ever happened to her. Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret sat in their plush, dimly lit bedroom, surrounded by the opulent trappings of their wealthy lifestyle. But despite the comfortable surroundings, the atmosphere was tense and foreboding. Pastor Emmanuel paced back and forth in their bedroom, his face etched with worry. "I tried to discourage him from coming back now, but Collins is stubborn. He's already boarded a flight." Sister Margaret shrugged as she responded, "I don't see any wrong in our son coming to visit us. He's been in New York for 15 years now. It's only normal for him to want to visit." Pastor Emmanuel glared at his wife as he spoke again, his voice serious. "It's not a good time, Margaret, do I have to remind you?" Sister Margaret's expression turned tense as realization suddenly dawned on her. "It's that time of the year Zala gets to pick a church member himself." Pastor Emmanuel nodded in agreement. "It's the major reason we sent him far from home at 13. Sister Margaret's expression changed, a calculating glint appearing in her eye. "You know, I was really thinking his visit would be good. I was hoping I'd hook him up with Eve. I don't like that white girl he's seeing." Pastor Emmanuel raised an eyebrow. "Eve? What makes you think Collins would be interested in her?" As Sister Margaret was about to respond, Pastor Emmanuel cut her off. "Well, that's not the issue here." Sister Margaret placed a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder as she spoke softly. "I'm sure Zala will not choose him. You have been faithful and obedient to him, and you have never said no. Worry not, I'm sure he'll spare our child." Pastor Emmanuel sighed before he spoke again. "Well, we have 3 weeks, we'll definitely think of some way out. I'll visit Pastor Jerry tomorrow." "Good," Sister Margaret said. "I'll focus on Eve then." The couple always had a way of getting whatever they wanted, and they were confident this time would not be any different. The next morning, Collins stepped out of the pastor's sleek G-Wagon, his eyes widening as he took in the sprawling church complex. The driver, resplendent in his crisp uniform, handed Collins' luggage to the servants who had come out to welcome him. Collins's parents, Pastor Emmanuel and his wife, waited at the entrance, their faces etched with forced smiles. They exchanged awkward hugs with Collins, their eyes betraying a hint of tension. "We're so glad you're home, son," Pastor Emmanuel boomed, his voice a tad too loud. Collins beamed, oblivious to the undercurrents. "This is incredible. The church has grown so much since I left." As they walked towards the church, Collins's gaze roamed over the manicured lawns, the sparkling fountains, and the imposing spire that seemed to reach for the heavens. His parents exchanged a fleeting glance, their eyes clouding for an instant before they resumed their bright, welcoming smiles. "Let's get you settled in," Collins's mother said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We have a lot to catch up on." As they disappeared into the church, the air was filled with excited chatter that the long-awaited pastor's son was back. But amidst the warm smiles and welcoming gestures, Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret exchanged a weighted glance, their eyes whispering a shared secret. Collins's return spelled trouble, and they were the only ones who knew it. That evening, a thick silence hung in the air as Pastor Emmanuel sat uneasily on the luxurious couch, away from the more composed figure of Pastor Jerry. His eyes darted around the room, unable to focus on any one thing. His fingers gripped the edge of the couch, knuckles pale with tension. "Collins is back," he muttered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might invite some unspeakable consequence. Pastor Jerry didn't flinch, his expression unchanged. "Isn't that a good thing?" he asked, though his tone held a subtle undertone of something deeper, something unspoken. "It should be," Pastor Emmanuel replied, his gaze flickering to the dark window beyond. "But Zala." His voice dropped, thick with dread. He paused, watching Pastor Jerry's face, searching for recognition. But when it didn't come, he pressed on, frustration leaking into his tone. "It's the season again. Zala's time, when he chooses his own. What if he picks Collins?" A sigh escaped Pastor Jerry's lips, slow and deliberate. His eyes, dark but calm, studied Emmanuel with a mixture of pity and something more calculating. "Zala's not an easy thing to deal with. But you've been faithful, Emmanuel. He'll see that. He'll understand." Pastor Emmanuel's hand trembled slightly, his gaze drifting to the dim corner of the room where the church's ancient altar stood, a faint flicker of candlelight dancing around its cold stone surface. "Jerry, you don't get it. You've been in this game long before me. Your rank, your wealth, you have options. His voice faltered. "I might lose my son. Or worse, my mind." A long pause followed. Pastor Jerry's eyes flickered to the ornate painting hanging on the far wall, a masterpiece of dark, brooding figures tangled in cryptic motions. The silence between them grew heavier with each second, a lingering sense of dread wrapping around both of them. Finally, Jerry leaned forward, his tone sharp, yet laced with an ominous edge. "We can't let that happen, Emmanuel. You need to appease Zala before the choice is made. If you don't, it's over. For you." The words hung in the air, oppressive and cold. "How?" Pastor Emmanuel's voice cracked, a mixture of desperation and disbelief. Pastor Jerry's eyes darkened as he leaned back into his chair, folding his hands together. You'll need to offer him something he can't resist. A chill ran down Emmanuel's spine. What are you suggesting? Pastor Jerry's eyes glinted, his lips curling into something like a smile, sharp, predatory. Sacrifice 3 people. A virgin girl. A virgin boy. And a pregnant woman. Pastor Emmanuel's heart skipped a beat. A pregnant woman. The words slipped out before he could stop them. His mind raced. He hadn't seen one in the church since the last one had delivered. What was Jerry talking about? Pastor Jerry leaned in closer, his voice low and insistent. You'll find one. They're out there, Emmanuel. You know that. You'll find her. He paused, then added with chilling precision, and the girl, she must be a virgin. If you bring Zala an impure soul, you will all pay for it. Emmanuel's stomach twisted into knots. But how will I know? How can I be sure? Jerry's hand slid into his coat pocket, emerging with a small vial of iridescent liquid, glowing faintly in the dim light. This will tell you when you found her, he said, pressing it into Emmanuel's hand. The liquid shimmered as if alive. Be careful. Zala's demands are exacting. One mistake, and you'll lose everything. Emmanuel's heart pounded in his chest. He felt the vial's weight in his hand, but it wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. His breath quickened, panic rising in his throat. But the pregnant woman. Emmanuel stammered, his voice trembling. Jerry's gaze turned cold, as if the conversation had already ended. That's all, Emmanuel. Consult the high priest if you need more guidance. But you know the cost. His tone was final. And Emmanuel, they must all be members of your church. Pastor Jerry added. Pastor Emmanuel nodded weakly, his hand still clutching the vial. He turned, walking away from the shadows that had suddenly grown so much darker. His mind churned, but one thought echoed over and over like a distant drumbeat. What had he just agreed to? The door clicked shut behind him, and the room fell back into an oppressive silence. After his visit to Pastor Jerry, Pastor Emmanuel hesitated as his wife waited for him to speak, a look of concern on her face. Emmanuel, I'm not a witch, so I definitely can't read your mind. You need to speak, she urged him. He took a deep breath before speaking. I don't think we can get everything he said before Zala makes his choice. Sister Margaret's eyes narrowed. What did he say? Pastor Emmanuel hesitated. He said we need to offer a sacrifice to Zala. A virgin girl, a virgin boy, and a pregnant lady. Sister Margaret's expression turned cold. And? We don't have any pregnant ladies in our church, Pastor Emmanuel said, frustration creeping into his voice. Sister Margaret's eyes sparkled with determination. Leave that to me. I'll take care of it. Pastor Emmanuel glared at her. How? He asked. I've always handled the impossible jobs, have I not, Emmanuel? She spoke with confidence evident in her voice. Pastor Emmanuel handed her a small vial. Pastor Jerry gave me this. He said it will help us identify the virgins. I don't know how it works. Sister Margaret took the vial, a sly smile spreading across her face. Don't worry, Emmanuel. I have everything under control. Pastor Emmanuel looked at her, a mix of relief and unease. What are you going to do? Sister Margaret's smile grew wider. Leave everything to me. We'll appease Zala, and he'll spare our son. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of their dark intentions. Following Collins's return, activities carried on in the church like always, the choir rehearsing and many other activities in church. Sister Margaret's plan to matchmake Eve and Collins seemed abortive as she had to focus not just on matchmaking them but also on the problem they were trying to prevent. Meanwhile, with time, Sister Margaret had already devised a plan to identify the virgins in their church for the virgin sacrifice required to appease Zala. Her solution involved hosting a dinner for the church's youth, where they would secretly add the mysterious substance Pastor Jerry had provided to the food. This would reveal the identities of the virgins among them. It was something she would do on her own, but she needed Eve to help her organize the church youth. In order to have this conversation with Eve, she invited her to dinner at their residence, also hoping to introduce her to Collins. Killing two birds with one stone. Eve arrived innocently, unaware of Sister Margaret's ulterior motives. As they sat down to eat, Sister Margaret smiled warmly at Eve. "Eve, dear, we're so glad you could join us." Sister Margaret spoke kindly. Eve smiled and responded, "Thank you, Mama. It's really a pleasure to dine with your family." Sister Margaret nodded and continued. "Tell me, what's new with you in work?" Eve launched into an enthusiastic account of her latest achievements, and Sister Margaret listened attentively, nodding along. "I was recently promoted after we launched the project I headed. It was meant to be a trial, but it turned out a perfect project that impressed our investors." Eve spoke happily. "Wow. Collins, did you hear that? Our youths here in Nigeria are also doing remarkably beautiful." Sister Margaret nudged her son. Collins, seated beside Eve, couldn't help but notice how radiant she looked in the soft light. He nodded and smiled at Eve. He could not deny that Eve was attractive, but he still had to stay faithful to his girlfriend abroad. "And Eve," Sister Margaret started, "we've been thinking of a way to empower some of our youths. My husband and I are really grateful for the wonderful work you all have been carrying out in the church. So we decided to have lunch on Friday with all of you and discuss it properly." "Oh my goodness!" Eve exclaimed happily. "It's a wonderful decision, Ma. The youth will be so excited to hear this. I'll inform them tonight," she said while immediately sending a text to their church youth group forum to inform them, and immediately got positive response. "Good," Sister Margaret said. As the conversation flowed, Eve mentioned that her pregnant elder sister had recently moved into town and was staying with her. Pastor Emmanuel's eyes snapped towards Eve, his interest piqued. He had been quiet all along, but finally, something caught his attention. "Ah, congratulations to your sister," Pastor Emmanuel exclaimed. "Is she a member of our church?" Eve shook her head. "No, she's not really into church." Pastor Emmanuel leaned forward, his eyes shining with intensity. "Well, perhaps we can change that. It's essential for her to have God's guidance during this critical time. Will you bring her to our church, Eve?" Eve hesitated, looking uncertain. "I don't know, Pastor. My sister's not really into that sort of thing." Sister Margaret intervened, her voice smooth as silk. "Nonsense, Eve. We'll make sure she feels welcome. You have nothing to worry about. I guess we'll take it one step at a time, Ma." Eve responded. "Well, I have to leave now. My sister does not like to be alone at this critical moment." Eve spoke. "Oh, I understand, my dear. Collins, why don't you escort Eve home? It's getting late." Sister Margaret spoke. "Of course. Eve, please, after you." Collins smiled as Eve got up. As Collins walked Eve out into the night air, they discussed. "So Eve, tell me, how has Nigeria been so far?" Collins spoke. "Well, Nigeria has been Nigeria." Eve responded, smiling. Collins nodded, smiling in response. They strolled to a reasonable distance, chatting about life in the UK and sharing laughter. The evening air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, and the sound of crickets provided a soothing background melody. "Collins, I think you should go back." I can find my way from here. Eve spoke. Why? I don't mind taking you home. Collins responded. Eve chuckled then spoke. You've been away for so long, everything must look new to you. It's night already and I won't want you to miss your road. Eve said politely. Fair point. Collins responded. But next time, we could go for a walk so I can get acquainted to the environment. Eve nodded in agreement. As they bid each other good night, Collins headed back to church while Eve continued strolling till her phone beeped with a message from her sister. Eve dear, I decided to stay over at Scarlett's tonight. Stay safe darling. And lock the doors, her sister's text read. Eve smiled as she suddenly remembered she had left her book and keys in the church during choir practice. She always did that. Eve rushed back to the church to retrieve her belongings. As she entered the empty church, the silence was oppressive, and the shadows cast by the flickering candles seemed to writhe like living things. Eve quickly grabbed her book and keys, but as she turned to leave, something caught her attention. A glowing drawing on the wall at the altar seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Eve's curiosity got the better of her, and she approached the drawing, her fingers reaching out to touch it. As soon as she made contact, the drawing began to glow brighter, and the air around Eve seemed to vibrate. Suddenly, a portal opened, and Eve felt an irresistible pull to step through it. As Eve stepped into it, it felt like she was sucked in by an invisible force. She found herself in a narrow, dimly lit corridor, the air thick with the scent of incense and something else, something metallic. Eve's heart pounded as she walked deeper into the corridor, her senses on high alert. The corridor eventually opened up into a large, cavernous space, and Eve's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. A massive stone altar dominated the center of the room, surrounded by strange symbols and artifacts. Eve approached the altar, her mind reeling with questions. What was this place? Why was it hidden within the church? And what was the purpose of the strange symbols and artifacts? Did Emmanuel ever know such a place existed within the church? A lot of question ran through her mind. Just as Eve reached out to touch the altar, she heard footsteps echoing through the room. She spun around, her heart racing, and that was when she heard a familiar voice. Sister Margaret, her voice laced with a fierce intensity. Emmanuel, I've told you to be calm. Everything will go as planned. She thundered, her voice echoing off the stone walls. I can't be calm when you're almost keeping me in the dark, Margaret. Pastor Emmanuel's voice echoed back as their footsteps sounded closer with each second. Eve quickly dodged under a stone built like a wardrobe just in time before Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret made it to the stone altar. Emmanuel, what is this? Relax. I've told you, we have everything under control. First you needed a pregnant lady and look, we found one today. Sister Margaret spoke. Eve quickly put her hand over her mouth to avoid a scream which turned to a gasp. Eve might be quite useful. She'll get her pregnant sister to join our church, that I must make happen. And then she'll organize the youths to come for lunch where we will select the virgins for the sacrifice. Sister Margaret continued. Eve could not believe what she heard. She could have sworn Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret would never be one of those kind of men of God. And in return, Sister Margaret continued. She'll marry Collins. That way she'll relocate abroad and never think of her dead pregnant sister. Eve almost jumped out of her skin. In fact, she blanched. How could this be true? Just when Eve had managed to put herself together, something crawled on her body and in a reflex action, Eve screamed, interrupting the discussion going on between Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret. She quickly held her voice back, but then it was too late. Pastor Emmanuel and Sister Margaret looked towards her direction. Someone's here. Sister Margaret said with disdain as she started taking gentle but resounding steps towards Eve's direction.